Okay, so firstly, what exactly is the Tiger Bench? Because I'm thinking of Tiger King. It's not related to the show.
No. It's a bench that you're tied to. It's a little bit misleading because when you look at it, it doesn't say, oh, that doesn't look like that painful, but it's essentially a bench where your legs are tied down flat and you're sitting up, and it's excruciating, especially after they leave you there for several hours, if not a day. I mean, people who can't walk after getting up from it. But it's essentially a bench that you're tied down to in sort of in what looks like a sitting position.
What does it have to do with tigers?
That I don't know.
Okay.
That I don't know.
All right. I just needed to sort of get to the end of that because it was weighing on my mind somehow more than many of the other things that we've been talking about.
Perhaps your mind's trying to distract you from all the other stuff.
From all the horrible things, yeah.
I mean, I do
It's a coping mechanism, Matt.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But that does remind me how, like, on Alibaba, like, you could buy interrogation chairs.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
Yeah,
like the metal chairs.
It has gotten to the point where you can go on, like, the Chinese version of eBay and buy a torture chair. Like, that's how prolific the use of these devices has become.
Well, but it just means there's a market for that, right?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, also how a lot of the quarantine camps that were built in China post-COVID were pretty obviously repurposed, like, labor camp structures.
Yeah, they were like prefab detention centers. You can use them for Uyghurs. You can use them for COVID victims. You call it
iron bars over the doors and windows. There were a lot of things that
because the iron bars are to prevent COVID from getting out.
That's why. Yes,
that's thinking.
Yeah,
that's thinking.
Yeah,
they're really smart.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of COVID, I'm curious about how that has affected things like the campaign against Falun Gong in China. Is it less bad since COVID because they've had to redirect a lot of resources to, their zero COVID policy and locking people up?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the first things we go through in this report is several of the trends we were seeing. And that was the interesting one because you'd think with everybody locked up, especially in the Wuhan area initially, that all the numbers would go down. What we saw is that arrests and what we call harassment, because, the CCP breaks down your door, you're having the middle of dinner and sort of ransacks your home, yells at you, threatens you, and leaves. So what do you call that? I mean, that happens a lot to Falun Gong. It's just short of being actually detained and brought into a police station. So we call that harassment. Just so you know what that statistic comes from. So if you look at arrests and harassment, those actually went up a great deal starting right when COVID started. I mean, it was an enormous jump from just the year prior, whereas sentencing, as you would expect with everything shutting down, actually went down for like the first 6 months or 8 months. And so when we looked into that, I mean, it was very clear to us why that's going on. And that is when something bad inside China happens, they look at the Falun Gong community as, to them, what it is, which is a network of getting information out of China. And so their impetus from the beginning, of course, has been to silence a religious minority, persecute a religious minority, but it is also to make sure that network, which has proven very proficient in getting stuff out of China, doesn't get something out of China. And around Wuhan was some of the worst areas. So you saw cases of being arrested and harassment go way, way up. They actually had to bring police officials into the Wuhan area because a lot of them were sick with COVID in order to sort of manage this uptick on Falun Gong. And that was one of the surprising numbers that we saw in China. And if you look at some like some of the specific cases, like there's this lady named Shuna who's, back in 2008, her and her husband were coming home from a concert. They were picked up. They had a Falun Gong book in their bag, and they were both put in detention. He died a week later. She spent years in a prison camp. She was tortured. She's back out, and then along comes COVID, and she and a group of, I think, 10 friends were all arrested in this group arrest in Beijing, not because necessarily they practiced Falun Gong or anything like that, because they were taking pictures of what was actually happening on the streets of Beijing during the COVID period where the CCP going, Beijing's good. We don't have a problem here anymore. And she was taking pictures and sending that out. So that was happening a lot. So they were really going after Falun Gong to silence COVID reporting. And that's why you saw an uptick there.
Yeah, one thing that was that Shelley and I found interesting in your report is one of the early Wuhan whistleblowers, Feng Bing, you said in the report they were a Falun Gong practitioner.
Yeah. I mean, he was one of the big ones, right? He was right at, I mean, I think end of January, the 25th, around there, where they're still saying everything's very much under control in Wuhan. He's sending out pictures of like body bags and the huge lines.
He was broadcasting on YouTube.
I didn't know he was a Falun Gong practitioner.
Yeah. He's a Falun Gong practitioner.
Oh yeah, because there was a lot of media coverage of him.
Yeah.
We did stories on him and some of the other whistleblowers too. Never saw anywhere that he was Falun Gong.
So now I see why the CCP perceives Falun Gong as being so dangerous during COVID. It's just like people who are like you spent the last 20 years doing like documenting horrible things the CCP has done inside China, and so like now it's escalated to the point where it's no longer just about going after Falun Gong, as you said earlier. It's about like covering up the cover up that covers up the cover up. Like that whole, like you just sort of spirals out of control. Like a lie, like you lie, it's like one small white lie that just like gets out of control, as you try to cover it up.
And, it's interesting how that started, because in the first few years of the persecution, when I mentioned the Falun Gong are printing leaflets out and putting them on front doors at night and stuff and letting people know all the stuff on state-run televisions and nonsense, they were hitting a lot of resistance. And what we found inside China, at least, is that people were just highly brainwashed. They're like, hey, if the CCP says you're bad or evil or this or that, you probably are. And so at some point in the community, we decided if we're going to get people to listen and understand what's happening to us, we're going to have to tell them who the CCP thing really is. So let's go back to the beginning and have that conversation. And so a lot of the materials that Falun Gong community inside China passes out is not really just about Falun Gong. It's also about, how the CCP came to power, how many people they've actually killed, what all those, different movements were about, and really dissecting the history of the CCP. So there is an impetus already, not just because, something's bad and I'm going to report anything that's bad, but there's very much there's very much an intent to say, look, the CCP is really evil. Clearly, you're not listening to us. We're going to tell you who the CCP really is. And out of that comes all this impetus to report things like COVID, things like SARS. The same thing happened in SARS. I mean, the network of Falun Gong practitioners knew about a mystery illness 2.5 months before it hit the world stage. I mean, we didn't even know what it was when we were getting the reports out of China. It was just, this mystery illness that was passing around. So there is very much an impetus in the community to report this stuff. Yeah.
And have you seen a change in the attitudes of people in China?
That's one of the bright parts of my day, Shelley, I'll have to say, is that because it's so dark so often, but there are so many of these little pockets. It might be a village somewhere or some sort of little precinct in some far-flung corner of Shanghai where, the local Falun Gong people they know the police officer, they know the chief of police, they know the CCP guy, and they've been talking to this guy for sometimes years. And at some point, a change happens just in that little piece. So there are these little pockets all around China where they've kind of said, we're not doing this anymore. And so you see a lot of that. So that does happen, and it's one of the few bright spots that come.
When you say we're not doing this anymore, what do you mean?
We mean they're not gonna follow the CCP to persecute Falun Gong, because normally they have quotas every year. This is how many Falun Gong people you got to detain and brainwash and convert to love the CCP again. And those campaigns take different names. I mean, they roll out different sort of initiatives to keep the persecution of Falun Gong going.
Can I just say that's a horrible idea to have a quota for how many Falun Gong to arrest every year? Because the problem is that you're actually incentivizing them to have more people practice Falun Gong and to release them earlier so you can keep arresting them to meet your quota. It's
because
just
you're going to run out of people?
Yeah,
is that
otherwise
what
you
saying?
run out. It's a really poorly thought out quota system. Just, if you're watching Chinese Communist Party, bad idea, don't do the quotas.
You heard it from Matt.
I didn't think about it from that angle, I got to say.
Yeah.
This is smart brain thinking, yeah.
So, I mean, what happens if they don't meet the quota? Like, if they're like,
Well, a lot of the times they get demoted. And this has been happening since the very beginning. I mean, this is something that Jiang Zemin almost pioneered. I mean, I think he elevated more generals in 1 year than all his predecessors over like a decade. I mean, he was crazy about elevating people who were going to support the anti-Falun Gong campaign and demoting and kicking out people.
Well, that was his whole thing about building up the internal security apparatus, right? Because China used to be like the military was like the big spending thing, and when when they went after students in Tiananmen Square in 1989, it was the military who came in. But they don't use the military for internal stuff anymore because Jiang Zemin created this ginormous internal security apparatus through the PLAC, the People's, what is not called that?
It's political
legislative. You know the rest. It's an acronym.
My brain went Action Committee.
I
And then
know,
I
that's
went,
what I- no.
no, wrong country. Political Legislative Affairs Committee.
That's the one.
Mission, sometimes
yes,
commission.
led by that guy who looks like a thwomp. What's his name?
Zhou Yongkang.
Zhou Yongkang.
Not anymore. He's in prison for the rest of his life.
Oh yeah, okay, with power struggle stuff, right? But like, one of the things that changed is a few years ago, like the spending for the internal security crossed the line where it's now greater than the spending on the military. And that's crazy because we've seen how much China's military, the People's Liberation Army, is building up. It's building up the army, the navy, their air force, their rocket force. And yet to see that internal security spending is still outpacing that. Like, that's crazy. And
I mean, if you think about it, I mean, how do you get, a person to go torture somebody? I mean, how do you do that? And this person probably has kids, goes home to his wife. And I mean, the monetary incentive to break a Falun Gong practitioner was enormous. And it still is a key factor in driving the persecution around the country.
that it's just like you pay people enough money and they'll torture anyone.
I mean, I think you also have to do some psychological things about making them like subhuman, right? Like, this is not a person.
Like, you got to make, like, the way that the Germans, like, referred to the groups they wanted to go after, the Nazis, I mean, not the Germans, but like they create, so this group is like a subhuman. This is like an animal. Or like the way the Japanese treated the Koreans as like a inferior race almost.
Well, you think about what Mao said even in one of his early speeches about the People's Democratic Dictatorship, right? And he was like, okay, the People's Democratic Dictatorship, like the CCP is the People's Democratic Dictatorship, and we need to listen to the people. However, the counter-revolutionaries, the rightists, like he listed a whole bunch of groups, and he's like, these are not the people.
They're sub people.
He didn't say sub people, but he basically was like, because they are against the revolution, they don't count, and that's the dictatorship part. Like, these people need to be controlled. Like, the counter-revolutionaries, the rightists, they need to be controlled,
right?
And they are not the people, right?
Yeah.
So
well, I'm not clear Mao thought very highly of people in general, because remember his whole thing about how, like, he told the Soviet Union that, like, oh, we have 600 million people in China. If like half of them die in a nuclear war, like, not a big deal. We'll just rebuild, right? Like, he's like, we got a lot of people, like, no biggie.
let's just say, the sciences were not Mao's strong suit.
The sciences?
Well, I was thinking biology, agricultural sciences. Like.